Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our discussion on reimagining housing policy, how to achieve a better foundation through state and local policy solutions. Really excited to be joined here by a terrific panel of practitioners and advocates and experts. But before we get into our panel discussion, I'd like to thank the Manufactured Housing Institute for sponsoring our Summit for Housing Changemakers and for sponsoring today's panel discussion. Before we dive into the topic at hand, I'd like to turn to Leslie Gooch, the CEO of Manufactured Housing Institute, to provide a video message.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you to the Up for Growth team for convening this important summit. At MHI, our focus is on elevating housing innovation and expanding attainable homeownership. Manufactured homes are a critical source of affordable, high-quality housing, making the dream of homeownership possible for millions of Americans. Since this panel is about what the future of housing looks like, I wanted to share with you a short video filmed this past June when 3 manufactured homes were on display on the National Mall.
Affordable housing is one of the top issues on my constituents' minds, and manufactured housing is a critical component of housing affordability.
We know our nation has a housing supply problem, and we need to find answers. And so manufactured housing actually could be a solution for low-cost, affordable, sustainable, and energy-efficient housing for families across America.
We want to have a variety of housing option, housing stock that suits every income, lifestyle, and choices that people want to make. It's how you build wealth in the United States of America. You build wealth through your personal home, and manufactured housing is a part of that menu of options for people in our country.
I think that we can't solve our problem without it.
So many people are suffering today with inflation, interest rates, everything else, that if we can help them get into an affordable housing solution, it relieves all their other burdens.
The manufactured housing is typically considerably less expensive than a site-built home.
$236. They can rent this unit for $800 a month. I don't know where, anywhere in the country, and I travel almost every week, that I've seen something like this that is that affordable.
For people who earn approximately $30,000 per year, it's hard for them to qualify for a loan to buy a house. But you only need $30,000 per year household income to rent a home from us. That's what affordable housing is.
The cost of housing is one of the biggest issues that we face in Virginia, especially in Northern Virginia. People can't afford to live here, so this could be part of the solution.
A lot of folks that know about manufactured housing and are clued in on affordable housing issues have never been able to walk into one of these homes.
Under $250.
Hey, this is great. Wow.
A countless number of people that walk through here and say, my God, this is a manufactured home, and they look around, they see the amenities and they see the features, and they know that this is a real solution for the affordable housing crisis that the country is facing right now.
They're energy efficient. They are move-in ready. I think it is one of the biggest solutions to one of the biggest problems we have. I'm just blown away. I want one right now.
Thank you again for the opportunity to sponsor this important event. We hope you will agree that manufactured housing is a critical part of the future of housing in America.
Great. Well, thank you again to the Manufactured Housing Institute for being a great partner and collaborator in our fight to achieve housing equity, eliminate systemic barriers, and ultimately create more homes. So I have a presentation that I can share before we walk into the panel discussion around policy solutions. In lieu of formal introductions, I think we're going to really try to have a conversational breakout today, and so I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves as we dive into the conversation. But before we go there, I'm going to just update, provide sort of an overview for everyone in this room on A Better Foundation, which is a policy framework that Up for Growth released as part of our 2022 Housing Under Production in the U.S. report. So, clearly, and I think we got into this issue in today's opening plenary, but why is there an affordability problem in this country today? Well, a big part of that is we are not building enough homes relative to meeting housing needs in far too many places, all four corners of the country, from places that come immediately to mind, like New York, Boston, Massachusetts, California, but all sorts of suburban, exurban, and rural communities, states from Kentucky to Georgia to Florida to Texas on up to Illinois and throughout the Intermountain West. Communities don't have the housing that they need to meet the communities that folks serve. From a list perspective, we've ranked. What are the states that have the most severe, most pressing shortages of homes? What are the metropolitan areas? And I think the key takeaway for me from this slide is that it's not just Los Angeles and New York, but places like Philadelphia, states like Arizona and Utah that are appearing not only as having severe shortages or underproduction of homes, but those shortages, that underproduction is growing at a fairly rapid clip. We can see here, when we kind of drill down to the state-by-state level, obviously California is a big part of the conversation around America's housing shortage, certainly making up about a quarter of the underproduction nationally as of 2019. But states like Texas and Georgia and Florida are places that are actually seeing their shortages rise much faster, in fact, than the state of California. And we can unpack that, and I'm sure we will unpack that as we have our conversation today around what's going on in different corners of the country from the perspective of how much housing do we need, and how are we seeing housing get built in these places. I'll also just sort of end as far as the problem statement here, that we know that there is a correlation between underproduction and rental affordability, but our research found that there is actually a higher correlation between underproduction and access to home ownership. And I think far too often this conversation about zoning reform, about housing supply and affordability, really focuses on the rental side of the market. And while that is critically important, we also need to talk more about access to home ownership and the ability to, as we saw in the message from MHI, how our current sort of broken housing ecosystem, the underproduction that communities are facing, are really trapping people into being renters for longer periods of time and unable to tap that wealth building opportunity of getting into home ownership. So that's the problem. I encourage all of you to take a look at the report if you're interested in delving deeper. But today is really about solutions. A better foundation is up for growth's bold vision for how do we not only meet housing needs for communities all across the country, but how do we create better, more equitable access to opportunity? How do we address the climate crisis that Americans across the country are facing? How do we set communities up to be more resilient in the face of the climate crisis that we are already experiencing? And how do we ensure a future where communities can increase economic activity, increase economic prosperity, and ensure fiscal sustainability? And that's true for local governments, state governments, and the federal government as a whole. So a better foundation is a place-based, rules-based policy framework that really thinks about three critical questions in terms of community development and housing policy. One is, how much housing do we need? Right? We talk about underproduction. What is the quantity of homes that communities should target in order to hit affordability benchmarks, in order to achieve these other goals that we've talked about? Number two, where to build. We are not agnostic to place, right? Building more housing writ large will be helpful to addressing affordability concerns, to meeting housing demand, but at the same time, we know that there are certain neighborhoods certain submarkets or communities that have a greater need for housing. That might be because there's a lot of jobs, but not corresponding housing. It might be that there's concentrations of community assets. These are places that create better economic mobility outcomes over time, right? So how can policymakers think about place and think about crafting policy to really optimize for better meeting the time, meeting the moment, in terms of delivering housing in the places that need more supply the most? And we're going to unpack that in today's conversation as well. And then finally, the what to build, right? And so we can talk about place, we can talk about how much, but look, if you look at the distribution of household types, and Chris Nelson in the room, leading demographer and urban planning thinker, has done quite a bit of work on this issue. Right, there's often a mismatch between the types of housing, right? We talk about family-sized units in cities, not having enough family-sized units. We also know that there's a lot more single-occupant households today than before, and there aren't necessarily a adequate supply of one-bedroom apartments or studio apartments or micro units. And so really thinking about how can we open up the ability for builders to build the types of housing that best meet really demographic needs, consumer preferences. And that's another part of this framework. So I'm going to step through kind of the 3 critical steps in applying a better foundation, and then we're going to get into, okay, what are the policies that can actually get us here? Because again, a better foundation is not a policy prescription, it's not a bill, it's not a silver bullet. It's really a way of imagining a different future than the perpetuation of the status quo, optimizing for affordability, for equity, for economic outcomes, as well as better environmental outcomes. So the first step is really this question about where. And the way that we ground a better foundation is through a opportunity mapping approach centered on racial and economic equity, which is to say, in the highest opportunity neighborhoods in too many cities today, you can't gain access to living in those places unless you make a certain amount of money, unless you can afford that large lot, single detached home, right? So how can we think about where we want to drive and enable more homes? And to do this, we really look at 3 factors. We look at the presence of jobs, but not corresponding housing. We call it jobs rich, housing poor. We look at economic mobility using data from Harvard's Opportunity Insights Lab, which looked at economic mobility by place or by zip code. And we look at the presence of walkability, of transit, of infrastructure, as really concentrations of community assets to drive better outcomes for residents. If a place, let's say, checks all 3 of those boxes, that's the highest opportunity neighborhood in our rubric. If you check just one of the 3 boxes, doesn't matter which one, you're at tier 3. And so this is a way of sort of thinking about place and opportunity present from neighborhood to neighborhood, census tract to census tract. Number 2, then we want to think about how much. And so part of this model is we want to optimize for more growth of housing availability in those tier 1 places. And so from a modeling perspective, of sort of casting that bold vision for the future perspective, we really just apply some simple ratios, right? Increasing housing by 40% for those tier 1 high opportunity neighborhoods, increasing housing by 35% for tier 2, 30% to tier 3. And what this gets you is a spatial allocation of the shortage, of the underproduction. And that can be applied at the national level, which we apply in our underproduction report. It can be applied at a community level, whether you're talking about Boston, Massachusetts, Des Moines, Iowa, or Arlington, Virginia. And then finally, in terms of thinking about the what, we apply sort of this density allocation matrix, which is to say, you might have a tier 1 high opportunity neighborhood with a very low density, right? It might be just a couple of homes over a couple or 3 acres. And in that case, we wouldn't be suggesting that policymakers radically transform the zoning to allow towers built in those places. We want to think about neighborhood context. We want to be thoughtful in terms of infrastructure capacity. And so this model really gets into how should policymakers be planning for that future how should they be looking at policies relative to the status quo in order to create housing opportunities, again, in those higher opportunity neighborhoods, but again, in a way that is not a fire hose approach of flooding previously undeveloped places with extremely high density, but rather a more incremental and broader brush approach in terms of covering more land, creating more opportunities across cities and towns on a broader basis. And so really thinking about what do you have today, what are we proposing in terms of increasing the number of homes, and what do those homes look like? And again, this is not a policy. This is a way to sort of envision an alternative future to the perpetuation of the status quo, which is broken. And then ultimately to sort of get at how can we look at that future and what are the missing policies, what are the missing tools, what are the impediments that exist today that preclude that future from coming true. So it's a way to sort of think about a gap analysis between the status quo and the policy environment that we need to truly achieve housing equity. So that's the model in a nutshell that we talked about in our report. And today, the conversation is really going to be about, and we have, by the way, benefit statements, and this is available in the Housing Under Production report, and we can talk about the equity benefits, we can talk about the land conservation and environmental benefits, the affordability, the economic and fiscal benefits, as well as benefiting the economy writ large. But today, we're going to talk about how does this model comport to what the challenges are on the ground, what are policymakers and advocates and practitioners able to advance to create that future, to create a world where more homes of the right type are available in those high opportunity neighborhoods. And I'm just so excited to be joined by a panel of really leading experts and thinkers in the space for a conversation. So what I'm going to do for our conversation today is really sort of kind of go down the line here. I'm going to start with Dr. Arica Young, who's the Associate Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center, who's going to sort of open up the conversation about the where. Then we're going to jump over to Board Chair Katie Cristol of Arlington County, Virginia, policymaker in the trenches on housing solutions, who can chat more about that shortage and thinking about how much communities really need to achieve balanced housing markets. And then finally, we'll chat with Ahmad Ab-Khalaf, Senior Research Analyst with Enterprise Community Partners, who has spent a great deal of time developing policy research and analysis, answering the question, so what are the alternative housing typologies that we need? So we're really going to cover the ground of this policy framework and delve into what are the practical actions that policymakers, advocates, and practitioners can take, not just to build out of our severe underproduction of homes, but also create better communities that are more economically prosperous, affordable, and equitable. So Arica, a better foundation, as I shared in the presentation, suggests that policymakers identify barriers to housing in the highest opportunity neighborhoods. Taking a step back, I assume that demand is already high in the highest opportunity neighborhoods, right? And so there's lots of people that want to live in these places. Why aren't developers just going into these places and building more homes? Why isn't this why do we need to have a conversation around how to get more homes built in high opportunity places?
Okay, the first thing, that's a great lead in, thank you, Mike, into discussing zoning. Everybody knows we always start off with this discussion, zoning now. It used to be just redlining, but there's some things that happened beforehand. And one quote I want to give is from Dr. Sonia Hart, who's dean at the University of Georgia. In cities elsewhere in the world, the areas where people live are not necessarily reserved for that one type of human activity alone by legal mandate. So the fact that we have single purpose, single zoning, that we divide up parcels of land based on a single use is really unusual. And I was thinking about trying to do a little audience participation because it's a little chilly in here. So I So, I mean, we've all heard of Robert Moses, right? Yeah. Harlan Bartholomew, though. How many folks are familiar? Good, good. I have to be honest, for a long time, I overlooked just how influential this man was on American zoning. The fact that he did comprehensive plans from the period of about 1915, his firm, to the 1960s, over 500 North American cities, everywhere from Newark, New Jersey, Memphis, Tennessee, Louisville, Vancouver, British Columbia was the one that, and I lived up in Ottawa, and I could see some of the elements of North American style zoning. So it's not just a US problem. They're grappling with this right now in Canada. Los Angeles, Peoria. So basically the whole swath of the US and good chunks of Canada all experienced or they did comprehensive planning. Closer to home, Washington, D.C., 2 elements. He was on the transit board that worked on Metro, on laying out the maps for Metro. He also did comprehensive planning for the city, for the county of Montgomery County in Maryland and Prince George's. So closer to home, a lot of impact, as well as being on the presidential commission on the federal highway planning. And he had very clear views that he felt were scientifically based on how to properly divide up land for the best usage. Early on, we think of zoning as being very American. It actually came from Germany in the 1870s. And the idea was to try to keep steel mills and leather making facilities, tanneries, from being right next door to houses. So it sounds great. Nobody wants to really, I don't know if you've ever been by a pig farm, for instance. You don't have to be by it. You can be within about 20 miles of it, and you know it's there. But it was to try to address that, but we took off running with it originally in places like Baltimore, where we tried to explicitly use it. And I say we in the sense of our government, because we the people, we explicitly used that for racial segregation. And 1917, and it still baffles my mind that back in 1917, our Supreme Court said, nope, can't do that. Cannot use race as a means for dividing up and zoning land. Okay, well then it didn't, and that was the Buchanan-Whaley decision in Louisville. Okay, fine, there's other ways you can do that, right? Yeah. So if we make the housing single family, at that time, poor families, minorities largely lived in multi-family housing. So you just relegate the land that those types of homes can be in to areas close to industry and commercial. And those become sort of the only places where you have mixed use housing permitted, industrial areas. I don't know how many of you saw the New York Times article about the old original town in, I believe it was in Tennessee, but it sits on marshland. And it was the only land available, deep marshland, like prone to flooding constantly, but it was the only land available to newly freed slaves. And they don't want to lose that land. And you talk about climate change. These are a lot of times the very areas that are most hit by climate change. And zoning is the undergirding infrastructure, sort of the legal regulatory infrastructure that has created the system and allowed it to flourish. And some of the results of that, so the New York Times back in 2019 noted that 75% of land in American cities is zoned for single family use only. Desegregate Connecticut, 80% zoned for single family of the residential land, 40% 2 acres. There's actually, we had the manufactured housing on there. There are towns that are looking at making you have to have 10 acres of land if you want to put a manufactured house. 10 acres. I don't care how cheap the location is. 10 acres is going to get expensive anywhere, negating the very ability to use those types of housing. And the result of that is you get areas where employment, as we've moved away from the industrial age, employment becomes scarce in these areas, so your economic opportunity drops. Food deserts, they're cut off from retail. That's put in specific areas, largely in the suburbs, connected to the highway exits. So you're cut off from that, and education is starved. So those are just some of the, without going too much in, but some of the outcomes of this structure that we put in place in the 1970s, in the early 20th century. And to add to that, as one final closing point, yes, they got rid of regulation, they got rid of race being used as the purpose, but you can see how it was substituted with coded areas. And I don't have it on here. I'm going to send my slides so they can get distributed, but Katie was kind enough to show me a great slide, a great picture from Twitter that showed an article from the 1920s that said, do we want row homes in Arlington? Well, the reason she sent it to me is because I was just driving through Arlington and there were two other signs, and this is not to pick on Arlington, this can be anywhere America. But there were two signs, and one says, save our neighborhoods, say no to duplexes and upzoning. Ooh, duplexes. And then right next to it, someone, God bless them, had put a sign that said, basically it's your YIMBY sign, say yes to affordable housing. But you can see there's not a lot of difference between 1920s, 30s, do we want row homes, to say no to duplexes because it'll just destroy our neighborhood. Okay, point made.
And I want to stay with this for a minute before we go to Chair Cristol. So in terms of, the question of why aren't we seeing more building in the high opportunity neighborhoods, it's because there's no land left, right? Because we've built all the single detached homes we can, and that's all you can build by law.
Or what land is left, and I think a lot of you probably have saw the New York Times article, the land that's left is so regulated. I believe it's the National Manufacturing Housing Council that came up with the figure that it's about 40% of project cost is due to regulation. Now, I don't want you to think I'm up here against regulation, okay? I like being safe. I like having lots of things that regulation brings. But when you get to the point where it's sort of ironic that in a country where we're very vested in the idea of freedom and property rights, that we've ceded control over what we can do with our property and ceded the ability of other families to maybe afford to continue building wealth off of their property with, say, accessory dwelling units. That to me is just shocking.
Yeah. And for the room, I've pulled up our slide on this topic in particular, really looking at the Mapping Inequality Project data from University of Virginia at Richmond, I believe, that compared those old redlining maps from the 1930s, Homeowners Loan Corporation, to the zoning we find today. And there is a startling correlation between exclusionary single detached only zoning and those areas historically that were redlined. And so I think the through line is fairly evident, as is the connection with economic mobility, with the places that historically were redlined for whites only, being those places today that drive the best economic mobility outcomes. So, this explains the racial wealth gap. This explains so much of the policy challenges that are playing out throughout our society. So thank you for that history lesson, Dr. Young. I'd like to go over to Chair Cristol, and I'm going to sort of go to, this question of homeownership access versus rental. And I know we talked about this on our prep call. how does that argument resonate with you, given what you're seeing on the ground in Arlington around, the ability for folks to, climb that ladder of housing access? So I'd just love to get your perspectives on sort of the challenges that your community face.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mike, and thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. And that question about how much, right, and how that manifests in terms of the ability to buy your piece of the American dream and own a home is incredibly salient for us in Arlington. A very quick history of planning and land use in Arlington. We are, of course, very proximate to DC. We're really proud of and grateful to be a place of very high economic opportunity, not only because of access to high-paying jobs, but because of a really high-quality school system, great transit, and all of the preconditions that allow people to come to Arlington and either in their own lifetime or their children's really be able to climb that economic opportunity ladder. Arlington historically has pursued what we've described as sometimes the taper, alternately the bullseye. The idea was back in the 60s and 70s with this new underground rail system, we were going to concentrate density around our highest transit corridor, or our highest, most transit accessible corridors, and then taper down to the neighborhoods. Arlington has been very proud of that, and in many ways it has been very successful. We've been able to support significant population growth around those transit corridors without contributing to cars on our road or traffic congestion, which is a real point of pride. And Arlington has also been very committed to rental affordability in recent years, developing a lot of tools that allow for committed, affordable rental housing, whether that's our local investment funds that allow for the development of committed bricks and mortar, our own housing grants program, which is relatively unique. It's somewhat like the federal Section 8, but just local and locally funded. And so that has been a really kind of key piece of our history. We are now a community that is majority renter and has created what I think has effectively become a permanent renter class because of that taper. About 80% of Arlington, it is illegal to build anything other than one house on one lot. And that's what's outside of the taper. We have not, as a community, had that conversation. And what we have seen around us is the economic opportunities only growing in Arlington, the cost of housing, the consequences of national underproduction, regional underproduction only growing. And the disparity between the opportunity in our high rental areas and that 79% of the county has become inignorably tremendous. The average single-family sales price over the last year was $1.3 million. This is a community that has historically prided itself on being a place where middle-class federal workers and nonprofit employees and teachers could buy in. And because we have not paid enough attention to the consequences of the taper, we are rapidly losing and have lost a lot of that identity. So that really gets to the question of how much. We are now engaged in a spirited conversation to roughly outline the proposal we have on the table. We are calling it our Missing Middle Housing Study, a term with which I imagine everybody in this room is familiar, that envisions the possibility of legalizing up to small multiplexes, 6 to 8 units, by right everywhere that is currently zoned for single family. The catch, or the way to sort of control that or make sure that it's gentle density that appreciates the neighborhood context, is that any multiplex has to be within the same footprint of what's allowable under a single family home. So you really get that sense of that's going to be characteristic with the neighborhood. It means that you are probably very unlikely to realize an 8-plex on a 5,000 square foot lot, because the envelope of a single family home, once you calculate setbacks and lot coverage, is just not going to accommodate for that. But we have seen, as you can imagine, when land is that valuable and all you can put on it is one house, we have seen a tremendous wave of teardowns of those modest bungalows and creation of very large 6, 7 bedroom single family houses. So there's a fair amount of square footage you can get when your lot is, for example, 20,000 square feet. The reason, and this is sort of the last thing I'll say in closing, because I think about this a lot in context of Up for Growth's question of how much. One of the things, I think unsurprisingly, that we've gotten the most pushback or concern about in Arlington is that idea of the 6 to 8-plex. That's when to people it starts to feel like a multifamily building rather than single-family neighborhoods, although, as Arica mentioned, there are plenty of people who are opposed to just duplexes. But I think really the concern has been around the 6 to 8. Here's why we included it. That is what is required. That's the level of density that is required to actually deliver on the promise of something, of a new product that could be affordable or attainable to somebody making even 110% of the area median income. To say nothing of, that is the level of density required to allow a majority of Black and brown households within the greater metropolitan region to be able to afford something in these neighborhoods. We like to say in Arlington, especially when it comes to affordable rental housing, that we're victims of our own success because that housing is expensive because there's so much that's going on here that's great. And I think to some extent that's true. But I think we are also victims of our own failure. And our inability to look at this sort of compact that governed Arlington's land use for 2 generations has created the stakes where to get to the kind of community we say we want to be, which is an integrated, diverse, climate-sensitive neighborhood, we have to look at a level of density that is possibly beyond what a lot of people are comfortable with. I can't help but wonder, had this community been willing to consider duplexes and quads 20 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. Would things have gotten as out of hand as they've gotten? So it is a very live conversation. Believe me when I tell you, people have strong opinions on it one way or another. One of the things we're seeing that's really interesting, when we ask people for their demographic information, when they're willing to give it to us, when they give us feedback, is that the multiplexes in particular, the 6 to 8plexes, are very unpopular among homeowners. Again, not scientific data, but of those who gave us feedback, about 79% of homeowners were opposed to at least the multiplexes, and 79% of renters were supportive. And so I think that you are now starting to see that is the consequences of the taper has actually effectively become a divide in our community.
Yeah, I think of that as, I think we talked earlier about how, because of these policies and the taper structure that was established, years ago, you've been effective at creating access to neighborhoods through rental opportunities, but you effectively have a whole subset of your population that's locked into rentership. And it's almost like there's rungs missing from that ladder to get into a homeownership situation. And so I wanted to sort of maybe go to Ahmad next, because you've done work around, I know Dan Perelek at Opticos calls it missing middle, enterprise, you all call it small and medium, multifamily, but whatever you call it, you're talking about those missing rungs. So, I'm curious, what specific, Arica brought up sort of the zoning piece, right? The blunt force instrument of you can only build a certain type of housing in a particular area of geography. But I know that in your research you've identified many more layers to this. So I'm just curious, what specific policies can you point to that could move the needle for communities to, get this small and medium multifamily back into production?
That's a great question. Do we have like an hour to discuss those layers? Because there are too many layers. I think, first of all, just to give background information, we did national research and we said we're not going to define it by a certain number of units, per square footage of land, just because it's based on local density. So it's really interesting to see how Arlington defines what is missing middle, because, recent efforts in Minneapolis, it defined it more as triplexes, fourplexes. In New York City, I'm sure that would be way more higher, could be up to, at least, or maybe at least 25 units, up to 50 units on a lot. So that's just for the background information. I think although in the media, any zoning reform effort is often discussed as banning single family zoning, as if the government would prohibit any landowner to develop a single family home on their lot. That is not true. I think the appetite of the privately owned land to densify their lots is really important. And It's honestly a big issue in affluent neighborhoods, already built up. So a lot of built single-family homes valued at at least 1 million or higher. Because like, how do you convince those homeowners who typically oppose any form of higher density to densify their lots, even by adding an accessory dwelling unit? And then we, often talk about financial incentives. They would rather keep their single-family home untouched than tap into a financial incentive. So that's, probably the $1 million question. Like, how do you do that? And then there could be a way to look at, vacant parcels in certain locations, like maybe closer to commercial or retail zones, and think about, developing those parcels. And it could be different other locations, for example, areas that are seeing, rising interest or rising demand for rent because surrounding areas already been, taken by high demand for housing, and a lot of folks were priced out, so they moved into surrounding neighborhoods, and they could be potentially priced out. So you can think about, an anti-displacement solution by allowing lower or moderate income homeowners to become landlords and convert their single-family homes into a triplex or duplex and live in one of those units, rent out the other units, and tap into more home equity. Or you can think about, areas where you need to invest more to, boost economic development, and maybe zombie properties could be redeveloped into mixed use and mixed income, low density, multifamily housing. I think we often think about the first step, which is very essential. The first step in the zoning reform effort is to allow for some form of higher density or missing middle housing in land that was preserved for single family development. But then we should look at all the underlying zoning restrictions, because I think the best thing to do is to envision the type of missing middle that you want, and then make sure that those underlying zoning restrictions won't inhibit the development of that missing middle. So if you want up to 6 units, you want to make sure that you don't have excessive setbacks, excessive height caps, floor area ratios, or even excessive minimum parking requirements, because then not only it's financially infeasible to develop missing middle on this lot, it's physically infeasible to fit, at least 2 parking spots per unit, because then you would have 6 parking spots for a triplex. And then, like, how do you figure that on a small lot? And, we all know that minimum lot size requirements also can be a big issue. So I would say, looking at the appetite of existing owners of privately owned land, any underlying zoning restrictions, and then thinking about who will develop those properties, right? Unless it's a planned community with, multiple large developers or one large developer, then those projects will likely be pursued by smaller developer, and they have their own issues with accessing financing and qualifying for equity and debt capital and all of that. So also thinking about financing and lending products that are tailored for smaller developers, and making sure that they qualify for those products so they could develop missing middle housing on land that was previously reserved for single family development.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a number of things. I'm hearing, these building envelope regulations, setbacks, off-street parking requirements, height restrictions, et cetera, all can get in the way beyond the zoning map itself.
Yes.
I'm hearing opportunities around using either derelict properties, abandoned, vacant, I think you said zombie properties, or land for development, right? And figuring out how to grease the skids for infill development. I want to go to sort of this idea, though, of, we're talking about this future where We're creating more housing opportunities, a greater variety of price points, product types that better meet demand, better meet housing needs of the households who are actually in community. Who's doing it well? What are the cities or the towns that have enacted reforms or have regulatory frameworks in place that are realizing this vision where there is housing abundance in those higher opportunity neighborhoods? Maybe Arica, I don't know if through your work you've encountered any places that have kind of gotten it right.
I think, unfortunately, it's hard to say where any one place has gotten it right. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of these reforms, unfortunately, it's sort of like we woke up to the crisis just in the past couple of years. And so a lot of, Minneapolis was the first city to eliminate single-family zoning, but it's so recent. Mm-hmm. And also, to allow also accessory dwelling units. But the change is so recent, and there's, it's not enough to say you're allowed to do accessory dwelling units. Getting to Ahmad's point, if you start putting in, you can only have an accessory dwelling unit if the owner of the main property lives full-time, lives here X number of months of the year. There's all these things that are still being worked out. So I think there's different types of examples. Mm-hmm. One of the ones that I think of as being really intriguing is Oakland, California, mm-hmm. which, yes, it's really experiencing a crisis still in housing, but one of the things that they did back in the 80s was to permit manufactured housing that could match the local vernacular as infill. And you will see 2- and 3-story homes that just, you'd never think it was manufactured housing, but it is, as infill. I think in that term, that's one other example of success. There's so many. Philadelphia is one of the highest percentage of commercial to residential conversions. And everyone's sort of looking at office conversion. You have to be careful with that, because a lot of the buildings that are actually suitable for residential are the oldest sometimes, but they're not the buildings that are most underutilized. So a lot of buildings that are, for instance, 80s, 90s, they might be Class C, but they're totally unsuited for being used for residential housing. Where it gets successful are like those old industrial factories that you see in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. So there are areas. One of the other places that comes to mind is the state of Massachusetts, the unified application system that they use for financing, for applying for local financing for affordable housing. That's really, it just saves so much time for developers, and time is money.
Yeah, that's a key point. And I think certainty too, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking a lot about missing middle, but a big piece of the conversation is affordable multifamily. And it seems to me that oftentimes affordable development sponsors are making impossible choices about siting communities to build because the places where the land is cheap enough to compete for an affordable community often are the exact opposite by definition of high opportunity neighborhoods that a better foundation suggests targeting. So, Ahmad, I know obviously Enterprise Community Partners is a major stakeholder in the affordable housing sort of finance community. You work both in direct production, but also with lots of partners. So, curious how you think about the relative opportunity in terms of financing and availability for capital to get at this issue, which is to say, right, how do you see these conversations around zoning reform and the low-income housing tax credit and appropriations to the National Housing Trust Fund, right, connecting? Is there any insights or perspectives you can share on the capital side?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for federal subsidy, it's a little bit tricky because especially when the cost of land is really high, you want to build as many affordable units, and by affordable units, I mean subsidized units as possible. So in more expensive markets, I think it's hard to justify just building 6 units on a very expensive land. But then I think there's an opportunity more for market rate, attainable housing. So I think, when you think about densifying housing in a area that was preserved for single family housing only. So you're creating smaller units that could be cheaper to own or rent. It's really important to differentiate between, targeted affordable housing levels and then just attainable housing, or like cooling down the market rate value of those homes. For example, if they're usually attainable for households earning up to like 120 AMI, so could we increase the supply of housing in that area by adding smaller units in gentle density development? So maybe it would be attainable for households earning 80 to 100. But if you're thinking about subsidized housing that is affordable for folks earning up to 60% of the AMI of their area, then you would have to tap into subsidies. And again, it's hard because we often think about the economies of scale when we think about subsidized housing. However, there are some of our partners who are trying different lending products, like CPC in New York, where first of all, they have been trying to help with emerging or small-scale developers qualifying for lending, because we know that sometimes they're not able to meet lending requirements for net worth requirements or their balance sheets. Also, among some lenders and investors, the scale of this missing middle development is seen as risky because any vacancy is considered high vacancy. Some lenders and investors don't really get it, like, why are we investing in this type of housing? And that creates challenges to accessing financing. So also CPC has been trying to think about doing like in-house application process for this type of lending, so they would reduce the cost, provide those emerging or small-scale developers with more equity and higher loan to cost, so they would get also higher debt capital. So that could help for sure. And some cities are trying to tap into this space, like Minneapolis. They have their own program which provides gap financing for the affordable component of missing middle housing, and I think that's important because you're creating a new mixed income model among missing middle developments. Enterprise, we've been doing other work with BIPOC developers, but it's more about building their capacity, helping them access lending and financing to scale up their solutions. So it's not necessarily focused on missing middle housing, but I think a lot of partners are looking at this type of housing and supporting it financially where it makes sense, because again, the cost of land is really an issue in expensive markets to justify missing middle housing versus creating as many affordable units as possible.
Yeah, that's a great point. I just want to try to synthesize some of the comments I've heard, right? So
Right.
we have this complex web of barriers: exclusionary zoning, land use policies that tend to be discriminatory, get really technical in the weeds, off-street parking requirements, height restrictions, minimum lot size requirements, et cetera, right, which make it very hard to deliver more homes at attainable price points, both rental and home ownership, in the highest opportunity neighborhoods in communities around the country. So I'm hearing like step number one, and I want to come to you, Katie, on this, because this is very much what you're working on right now in Arlington. So step number one is clearing away all those barriers in the high opportunity neighborhoods. That then could unlock missing middle. It could unlock a wider variety of housing opportunities. And I think, Ahmad, the point you made, which is really important, is that takes the pressure off of the rate at which we're seeing rents grow. and home prices appreciate and become out of reach. And perhaps could create more opportunities for, by clearing away those barriers, create more opportunities for affordable housing, multifamily developers to build in the high opportunity neighborhoods. Because the land cost is a key consideration and driven by these things, right?
Yeah. Just one last comment. What Arica said is really important. Like, how do you measure success? Because this is a market-based solution. So the government, the state and local government, they have specific roles by easing those zoning barriers, but they're not building the housing themselves. Right. So you're relying on the appetite of the landowners and then developers who would pursue this type of development to create it at scale. So with that level of supply, the additional supply would cool down the market rate prices. So I think as someone who supports adding supply, I think it's hard to pitch it sometimes because it's a long-term solution and it relies on a lot of circumstances. So once you get all the circumstances right and you get to that level of supply that would cool down the prices, it may take X number of years. So it's not like a solution that will have a positive impact overnight, and that's the problem because all of those zoning reform efforts, they're more recent, so maybe we will see the success in 5 to 10 years, but also we have to make sure that any underlying restrictions and barriers are also addressed, and at the same time, making sure that all the private stakeholders are supportive and actually intentionally supporting this solution.
Absolutely. Well, and so Katie, obviously, we have created this situation through a long series of policy choices made well over a century, made over the course of well over 100 years. Obviously, it's not as simple as flipping a switch.
Right.
Can you talk about sort of where you're at in the process in Arlington? And I think, as Solomon brought up in the opening plenary, what are the precedent political sort of requirements that you need to have to be successful, and how's that going? So I just love to sort of get your sort of analysis of like, how do you actually get these solutions done? Yeah.
Let me know if you haven't answered that question. No, thanks, Mike. And you saw me like my head was nodding so vigorously when Ahmad was talking about the challenges of kind of measurement. So I will, I can say this because it's my ideological brethren in a community that is as historically liberal and democratic as Arlington. We are not used to deregulating our way to solutions, and so folks are having a really tough time, I think understandably so, saying, where's the measurement plan? And the idea that this is about kind of rolling back some of the barriers, but no, I can't guarantee actually what the price points of a 2-bedroom unit in a 4-plex in your neighborhood will be, right? It's going to be a function of the market. That is absolutely one of our biggest challenges. And I can say our other biggest challenge, I don't think most of us homeowners walk around understanding the degree to which the development potential of our homes is capitalized into the value of our homes already. And so what folks know is, my home is assessed at $750,000, for example. It's especially tough if maybe I bought my home in the 1970s for $70,000. I don't conceive of my home as having the development potential of a $3 million 6-bedroom brand new construction house. But it does, right? Because that is, if somebody were to purchase your home, that is the maximum amount of money that they could make building it. And so that value is already capitalized into the value of your home. So the reason that politically makes it so difficult to have this conversation, that kind of cognitive disconnect, I think, to be fair, is hard for all of us, right? Is that people say this is not a solution. You are unleashing the market to take my affordable bungalow and turn it into a luxury duplex, right? And so we really struggle. And so the measurement unit, I think of for success is what can be redeveloped and what are the price points of that new housing that's being redeveloped relative to what could have been developed, right? And so we say, again, a lot of parts of Arlington County, a new 6 or 7 bedroom brand new construction will sell for north of $3 million. That's affordable, roughly speaking, to somebody making 300% plus of area median income. So a 2-bedroom condo that can be sold for $600,000, that's affordable to somebody making 130% of area median income, that's huge, right? That's a major gain. And so that's sort of what we're trying to say, let's measure it that way. It is very hard to facilitate that mindset shift, to say the difference is the 300% AMI versus the 120% AMI. It's not the difference of what you might have purchased your home for a couple decades ago, or even what you think of your home as being valued at now. There is also just the uncertainty that Ahmad talked about. I think we really feel it, right? We can't say what developers are going to do. I think the thing I worry about, for example, is are the market incentives going to be for developers to develop very high-end duplexes instead of single-family houses? Well, listen, I think a $1.5 million, or $1.6 million half of a duplex is still better than a $3 million home, because there are going to be people who fall in that gap. That's a very big gap between 110% AMI and 300%. But it's not quite what we're hoping for in terms of really being able to unlock that. So I think one of the things we're talking about, I don't know if this answers the questions about politics, but the other thing Ahmad was talking about that really resonates with us is, so what are the tools as government we can use here? And we've learned that when it comes to the affordable housing side, or affordable rental side, it's kind of axiomatic in Arlington that our housing grants program does not work without our bricks and mortar committed affordable program. And our committed affordable bricks and mortar program does not work without housing grants, which is to say we cannot give somebody a housing grant who's making 30% of area median income, send them out into a market where rent for a 3-bedroom is $3,500. There's no way we could close that gap, right? So we need the units that are committed. And then similarly, it is, as people in here who do affordable housing development know far better than I, nearly impossible to develop housing in an expensive area that can be committed affordable as deep as, say, 30% AMI, right? 60% is ambitious enough. So we need the housing grants program to make that program work. So similarly, I think we have to map what we've learned from the rental side onto the ownership side. So there has been great interest in our community for a long time of thinking about the types of programs that could allow for moderate income home ownership. Work where you live programs for teachers and firefighters, incredibly popular. The idea of a community land trust, incredibly popular. The idea of expanding our moderate interest purchasing assistance program, very popular. People are floored when people will come to us all the time and say, well, why isn't there a program to support first-time home buyers with, low interest or no interest loans? And I tell them there is, and they don't believe it. And the reason that program is so undersubscribed is if your income is moderate enough to qualify, there is nothing available for you to purchase. And so all of these, there are a bunch of kind of, I guess you might say, like demand side subsidies that we are very interested in. They will not work until we can create an ownership product that is somewhere more in the realm of what is affordable. And so similarly, I hear all the time the major critique of the missing middle, again, the kind of deregulatory proposal is, well, that's not affordable. And folks are absolutely right. An $800,000 townhouse is not affordable. But an $800,000 townhouse paired with a program like our moderate interest purchasing assistance, now that supply or that government intervention can work, because the market might produce something where the gap is manageable enough. Or similarly, you talk to Habitat for Humanity and they'll say, we'd love to do work in Arlington. If you let us build a 6-plex, like now we're talking, we could actually do that. And then we could talk about potentially low income home ownership, which is really exciting for a community where, again, home ownership is off the table for all. But I would say either the wealthiest or the maybe the demographically luckiest who were here 30, 40 years ago before things got so bad. So it is, trying to understand the potential of all of those tools and the kind of necessary but not sufficient opportunity of deregulation. But I will say the politics of it were very tough. I think, I think ticked off probably about 5 or 6 things that feel counterintuitive to people, right? And it is, it's challenging for certain. I think the one thing I'll say just in closing, I am so delighted to see representatives of the Biden administration, like Solomon this morning and others, take real ownership of this housing production agenda, because I think that's a heuristic for people, right? I support, generally speaking, the Biden administration. If they're saying this is worth doing, then maybe I should think about how this applies in my community. So that's an area I think for national leadership, even if those budget requests don't end up filtering their way down to our programs. Just the thought leadership is really meaningful, and so similarly, I think and again, I'm speaking from a progressive community, but for progressive organizations nationally who have credibility to take on housing production as part of their agenda is really meaningful in terms of the politics on the ground too.
Absolutely, I appreciate that, and we're delighted to have speakers like Cy Richardson from the National Urban League speaking later today, on these issues. To your point, just to distill what you shared, I think there's a couple of takeaways for me. One is, there's a bucket of policies around zoning reform, tearing down these artificial barriers. There's a bucket of policies around resources for production, a whole variety, federal, state, and local sources. And there's a bucket of policies around demand side interventions. I think you're getting at this with, and these all have to work together, right? So, you have to have the voucher is no good if there's no units for residents to use that voucher to access. And if we can't, if we can't build the properties because of NIMBYism and because of the exclusionary zoning, then the funding for production is of little good. So it seems to me that the charge for all of us is to really work at the policy level to tear down the barriers, boost the resources, and boost the demand side pieces so we can start to systematically add those rungs back onto the ladder. I know we're at 11:13 and we're going to take some questions from the audience, but maybe I've given Ahmad and Chair Cristol quite a bit of time. I want to maybe let Dr. Young kind of wrap us up here, because your organization has been doing work looking at those different buckets. And so I'm curious, if it took us 100 years to get into this mess, right? Like, what do you see as the path out of it from a broad perspective? And then we're happy to open it up to audience questions.
Well, I made a joke earlier that if we could knock an asteroid off of its axis, we should be able to start addressing this issue in a meaningful way. But it's going to take, and this part I'm incredibly hopeful about. What we've seen at the Bipartisan Policy Center are lots of people, leadership at the federal, state, and local level that are coming together on both sides of the aisle, because whether it's rural communities, whether it's the coastal communities, everybody's facing this as a challenge. So one of the things that gives me a lot of hope is watching a lot of the bipartisan legislation that's coming out, be it from the YIMBY Act, the National Homes Improvement Act, which works to try to do housing preservation by giving access to loans and grants to communities to make needed repairs. We saw in the Inflation Reduction Act recently really great energy subsidies or energy grants and subsidies to help people make improvements on their properties that are environmentally sustainable. So that's where I see us finally having that housing is now being elevated to a national discussion point. And it's a bipartisan issue, and that's where I take my hope, and I think we can make some real progress.
Thank you, Arica. Well, I'll turn it over to Jenna, who has the mic, to maybe pass it around here. Looks like we have quite a few questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, Anastasia Nicolau with NAIOP, Massachusetts, so representing commercial real estate development in general here. And great to hear that Massachusetts is considered a model for our funding, although it can be very frustrating, I know, for individuals at times. Just touching on the fact that we've talked about, or you've talked about today, that many of these policies haven't had time to really show the effect on the market, but also looking at the fact that construction prices, at least in our market, have been increasing by 40% since the beginning of the year. The capital markets for multifamily housing production are not looking good for the next couple of years, at least in our market for now. Wondering how you're messaging or you suggest messaging that this impact and this kind of deregulation is actually still necessary, even though you won't see the ripple effects because of other market factors.
Oh, I would love to hear the answer to this question. Anastasia, I mean, you nailed it. This is what I worry about by far the most, is that we are going to both, hopefully, allow for these new types of housing at a time when the market pressures are such that housing is going to continue to become even more expensive. And then I think there are absolutely going to be people in our community who directly point the finger. I think this is possibly the single biggest misconception, right, especially with multifamily, as you well know, which is that luxury housing is the driver of gentrification as opposed to being a symptom of the same problem that causes gentrification. And I worry about this tremendously. I'm not sure what the answer is. I mean, I maybe naively wonder if research could be part of that, right? For NAIOP or for others to be able to articulate, look, this is the but-for scenario. We actually, this multifamily housing, had the parking requirements been what they were a year ago, the rents would have been this much higher. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the housing shortage is a number of features. We've talked a lot about the regulatory side, but that is my greatest worry too. I don't know if my colleagues have brilliant ideas about how to communicate about it.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think this goes back to the complexity of the housing challenges that we've been facing, right? And I think whenever I discuss a housing solution, I like to emphasize that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's like no one solution that can by itself fix our housing supply and affordability challenges. So you would need comprehensive, housing plan that would address all of those issues. And I agree, you can't talk about higher housing costs without talking about inflation, rising inflation, the cost of construction materials and labor and all of that. And I guess it's tough because going back to the points that we discussed today, because you could simply, as a homeowner, a community member, oppose any proposed housing development based on it's affordable to whom. This is not enough, but there's the reality of the market. Like, how do you pencil out that project? How do you make it financially feasible? And, Solomon mentioned, how do you maximize the use of public subsidies? So if all of those costs are really high, your, public dollars won't get much done. So it's tricky, but I would emphasize that it's like one tool in a more comprehensive housing strategy, and it won't fix all of the issues by itself.
Just a quick follow-up to that, I guess our concern, especially at the municipal level, is because those resources come from commercial property taxes and large-scale multifamily taxes. If they're not being built, you're not actually seeing an increase in the budget year over year, and so those resources aren't available.
Ooh. Yeah.
All right, this is not an easier question. But I think it's an important one. So in Mike's presentation, so Arlington is obviously super high opportunity. Amazon is coming to town. Raytheon is coming to town. Boeing is coming to town. And so according to the findings of this great report, the overall increase in the housing stock would be on the order of 40 or 35%. That's a huge change. Fundamentally, there would have to be massive institutional changes. And politically, what is the path for that?
Well, I mean, that's a good question for me. I think, I would turn to Mike's point about it is the how much in the framework is recommended to be context dependent. What's helpful about Arlington is that we at least do have a history of high density development. And so one of the things that you've seen, I can tell you for our constituents who are skeptical of adding more housing, this feels to them like an absolute fire hose because we're talking about missing middle at the same time we're talking about, amending our general land use plan in different places to allow for denser housing, thinking about densifying one of the kind of sort of commercial corridors, but really strip malls, right? And starting to think about, 10-story buildings, for example, because it is a transit corridor, or it could be in terms of bus service. So I know, it's I think sort of starting where you are and then looking to plus up everything. I think that question of, do you turn Do you try to argue for turning a community that is right now exclusively single family into high density development? You know, I'm not sure anybody has successfully demonstrated that that's politically feasible. And I'm actually not even certain that that's advisable, right? Because we do actually, one of the biggest conversations we're having as a community, I firmly believe this is the case, many people don't, that we have the infrastructure required to meet the really very modest population increase that would come associated with missing middle, in terms of, you know, enough seats in our more suburban schools, right? Our wastewater pipes being large enough, certainly parking and transportation. And so I don't think I could honestly tell someone that I have confidence that the infrastructure is ready to meet the capacity of, you know, a 10-story building in a neighborhood that has been exclusively single family since time immemorial. Since before that it was dairy farms, right? So I think it's probably going to be gradual, and so the question just becomes, I think politically, do we make sure we're being as bold as possible within the realm of the possible at each level?
One of the things that I feel that's been missing is a lot of public service announcements, like just educating. I'm sure we've all had the experience, you shake somebody's hand, well, okay, COVID kind of messed this up, but you shake somebody's hand at a dinner party and you say, yes, I do housing, and they go, what's this about zoning? What's this about? And one of the things that's just missing is educating people. Educating when they go, you know, I hear, what's affordable housing? So I think what we need to do at the local level is we have to start getting out and actually just having that dialogue and explaining to people. And like you were saying about what people don't understand about the intrinsic value within that they're already actually being taxed for. You know, what they can do with that. Like, there's just no conversation, no common language, and I think that that's really important. And then I'm going to steal a line from Jenny Schutz at Urban. I really think we really need to destigmatize renting. We need to destigmatize renting. You should be able to be on a school board, run for a school board, even if you're a renter. Why? Just because you live there. Your tax dollars fund it. And until we do that, until we allow the people, not just homeowners, but we empower renters to feel fully, a lot of them are in their communities for 30 or 40 years. So I don't know why we think of them as transient. I mean, in the last 15 years, I've moved like 3 times, each time buying a house, including overseas. So I don't know why we view them as transient, but we need to empower and encourage renters to take part in the political process, because that's going to make a huge impact on how we talk about housing on a really grassroots level.
Great point. Great point.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Scott Pedowitz. I'm with the Apartment and Office Building Association of Metropolitan Washington. So yes to everything you just said, Arica. On the political piece, I was actually, before we sat down, chatting with one of my new friends from around the country, and he was talking about the partisan divide around housing in his state, asked what it's like in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where I live and work. And I actually observed that the divide on housing is actually orthogonal to our partisan divide in Virginia, that some of our biggest supporters of increasing housing supply are some of our most progressive Democrats and some of our most libertarian Republicans. So that leads to 2 questions. One, how would you advise groups being involved to be able to message and to think about developing policy in a way that they're not poking at people who actually are their allies and driving them away? And then 2, because I see this happening too, given the current political zeitgeist and the siren song of negative partisanship, how do we fight against, or that's too strong of a word, but how do we counteract people who will use that to draw away potential allies because, well, how could you agree with those people?
Your thoughts?
Oh, wow, that's my day-to-day reality. You look for those common areas, and I think it's important to note that, ironically enough, one of the first groups that was sounding the alarm on zoning was Cato. and the libertarian side of the political spectrum. And I think there's no easy way around it. Like I wish there, I'm looking at one of my colleagues. We spend an awful lot of time at the Bipartisan Policy Center trying to figure out how we can message and be inclusive to both sides. And it's tricky. You find areas where people can agree. Things like accessory dwelling units, ironically. Like you have to hone down on the topics that you agree on. And that's sort of the only real way to do it. And surprisingly enough, take advantage of the time period that this is an area where, for once, we're all agreeing that we need housing. So it's really pinpointing what are those key areas that you have agreement on, and then trying to run with that.
And at the local level too, I think a lot of it is about knowing your context. On the one hand, I've been sort of joking, it's so bipartisan supported, that also means the opposition is bipartisan.
Yes.
So I had the pleasure on Friday night of getting a national headline from a group that styles itself as the MAGA alternative to the AARP, with my face, and we are the ones that Trump warned about in terms of the left-wing attack on the suburbs. And I thought I should show this with my constituents who think the missing middle is a right-wing conspiracy. Right? So there's definitely opposition on both sides, but I think it's, to your point, it's such a great example, Scott, because of thinking about it in terms of Virginia. I think you have to know your local context of where you're trying to get it done. And I can tell you for my community, for example, I think we are, we're still a little unclear about what the final policy will look like, but I'm pretty optimistic about getting something done. And I feel confident in saying that would not be the case had our NAACP and Sierra Club not endorsed it. They are incredibly important standard bearers for our values in the community. And I think there are probably parts of Virginia where, styling missing middle as a racial justice and climate change issue would probably sink it, right? So I think it's just so important to know your local context, and as an advocate, understanding who the valued voices are there matter a lot.
Thank you, Chair Cristol. And that was a great question to end with. I know we're at time. I will just say that, our perspective at Up for Growth, federal, state, and local, is that coalitions are everything. So really agree and echo your point, Katie. And if you are, I'll just say, if you are not yet involved, or if your organization's not yet involved in Up for Growth, I'd encourage you to get involved because, the best antidote to partisanship is showing the elected officials that this is truly a public interest issue, and it doesn't matter if you're a chamber of commerce or an apartment association or a deeply affordable housing developer. This is an issue that matters to everyone, and so that is, I think, the common thread between all of our work on really advancing these solutions. So thank you all for your time this morning, and I look forward to seeing everyone back in the ballroom for the lunch keynote. Thank you all. Thank you.